From the outside, my life looked carefully constructed, the kind of life people admire from a distance and assume must feel as beautiful on the inside as it appears from the street. Our house stood at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac where tall maple trees arched over the pavement like cathedral columns, their branches interlocking overhead in a canopy that filtered morning light into something soft and golden. In autumn, their leaves descended in slow, deliberate spirals, blanketing the sidewalk in rust and amber, as though the season itself was offering a confession it hadn't yet found the words for. Neighbors walked their dogs past our driveway every evening without fail. Children circled the street on bicycles while their parents exchanged quiet conversation beneath amber streetlights. It was the kind of neighborhood where people believed nothing bad could happen. Inside, everything reflected that same ordered quiet. The bookshelves were arranged by color, a detail Adrian used to tease me about affectionately. The kitchen counters were always spotless. Soft music played through the living room while I cooked dinner, filling the house with the illusion of warmth. My name is Victoria Hale. For 11 years, I believed I had built a life defined by trust, by partnership, by the kind of love that doesn't announce itself loudly but rather settles into the bones of a home and stays. My husband, Adrian Hale, ran a successful management consulting firm. I had been there from the very beginning, reviewing contracts before they were signed, restructuring financial frameworks he found too tedious to manage alone, anticipating problems before they surfaced. His success had always felt like our success. People admired us at dinner parties. They spoke of us as an example. They looked at me and saw a woman who had everything arranged exactly as she wanted it. For a long time, I believed them. The first crack appeared on a Thursday evening in late October, so quietly that I almost missed it entirely. Adrian had just come home from work, later than usual, though not unusually so. He moved through the kitchen with practiced ease, loosening his tie, setting his keys on the hook by the door, pausing to say something unremarkable about traffic. Then he excused himself upstairs to shower. His phone remained on the kitchen counter beside me while I finished washing the dinner dishes. It vibrated once. Then again. The screen lit up with a brief flash of white light. I wasn't trying to read it. My eyes simply moved before my mind had given them permission. The notification was already fading when the words registered. Did you tell her yet? 5 words. Unsigned, except for the contact name, N. Brooks. I set down the dish I was holding with careful, deliberate slowness. I stared at the dark screen for a moment longer than I should have. Then I picked up the dish again and continued washing. When Adrian returned downstairs 10 minutes later, hair still damp, the familiar warmth of his cologne following him into the room, he wrapped his arms around my shoulders from behind and rested his chin briefly against my temple. "You look tired," he said softly. I leaned into him the way I always had. "I'm fine," I replied. And I smiled. But something inside me had quietly shifted. Some internal mechanism that I didn't yet have a name for had begun to listen more carefully, to watch with a precision I hadn't known I possessed. For several days, I told myself it meant nothing. Business communications often sound jarring without context. A single sentence pulled from a larger conversation can imply almost anything. Consultants dealt in sensitive negotiations constantly, and Adrian's work was layered with confidentialities I was never fully privy to. There were rational explanations. I cycled through them the way a woman cycles through a rosary, methodically, hoping repetition would produce belief. It didn't. Small things began accumulating at the edges of my attention, the way water collects in the corners of a room before you notice the ceiling is leaking. Adrian started taking phone calls in the backyard, regardless of the weather. He would excuse himself mid-conversation, voice already lowering as he slid the glass door shut behind him. Meetings ran later than they used to. Not dramatically, just enough to require a revised explanation when I asked. One Tuesday evening, while hanging his jacket in the closet, my fingers paused on the fabric. A scent clung to the lapel. Faint. Floral. Something warm beneath it, gardenia, perhaps, or white musk. It was subtle enough that, on any other day, I might have dismissed it as proximity to someone in a crowded conference room. But I noticed it. And once noticed, a thing like that cannot be unnoticed. At night, I began watching him sleep beside me in the quiet dark of our bedroom, studying the familiar lines of his face as though I were reading a document I had always trusted but was now beginning to suspect had been edited without my knowledge. And slowly, with the patience of something that does not yet understand what it is becoming, doubt began to grow. The truth arrived on a quiet Saturday afternoon in the third week of November, while rain moved steadily across the garden windows and the house held that particular weekend stillness that I had once found comforting. Adrian had excused himself to take a call outside, stepping beneath the porch overhang with his phone pressed to his ear. He had left his laptop open on the dining room table, the screen still glowing. I was not searching for anything. I want to be clear about that. I walked past the table intending only to refill my coffee, but a notification appeared in the upper corner of the screen just as I passed, a small rectangular banner that expanded briefly before beginning to fade. Pediatric appointment reminder, Tuesday 10 a.m. I stopped. The banner remained visible for 3 more seconds before disappearing. But I had already seen what was beneath it. The email preview had expanded far enough to show the body of the message. 3 names listed in the appointment confirmation. Adrian Hale, Natalie Brooks, and a child named Ethan Hale. The room did not spin. The floor did not tilt. The rain continued against the windows at exactly the same rhythm it had maintained for the past hour. I stood beside the dining table and felt the entire architecture of my marriage reorganize itself around a single, devastating fact. This was not an affair. This was a family. A child with his surname. A woman whose name had appeared on his phone. A pediatric appointment scheduled on a Tuesday morning when I would have believed, without question, that he was in a client meeting. Not a mistake. A life. Constructed alongside mine. Hidden inside mine. My coffee cup was still warm in my hand. I closed the laptop. Carefully. The soft click of it shutting felt enormous in the quiet of the room, though of course it made no more sound than it ever had. I carried my coffee to the window and stood watching the rain move across the garden in slow, diagonal sheets. I counted my breaths. Not because I was managing panic, but because I was doing something more deliberate than that. I was deciding, in those 60 seconds of steady rainfall, exactly who I intended to be in every moment that followed. I heard the glass door slide open behind me. Adrian's footsteps crossed the kitchen floor. He appeared beside me, reaching past my shoulder to set his phone face down on the windowsill with the casual ease of a man who has never once considered that his wife might already know everything. He kissed the side of my head. "Everything okay?" he asked. Light. Conversational. The tone of a man checking in on a quiet afternoon. I turned to look at him. His expression was open and relaxed. Unbothered. I smiled. "Yes," I said. "Just watching the rain." He nodded, satisfied, and moved toward the kitchen to find something to eat. And in that moment, in that precise, unremarkable exchange, something finalized itself inside me. Not anger. Not grief. Something colder and more useful than either of those. I understood, with complete clarity, that the advantage I now held was not something to spend impulsively. Silence, deployed correctly, is not passivity. It is the most precise instrument available. That night, I lay beside him in the dark and did not sleep. The ceiling above us was pale in the ambient light that filtered through the curtain seams, and I studied its blankness the way you study a map when you are trying to determine not where you are, but where, precisely, you intend to go. I did not cry. I want to say that plainly, because I think people expect tears at a moment like this. The private collapse behind a closed bedroom door, the muffled grief pressed into a pillow. Perhaps that comes later. Perhaps for some women it comes first. But what came for me, in that long and sleepless dark, was something else entirely. Clarity. When betrayal is sustained, this elaborately constructed, it does not invite emotional collapse. It demands intellectual engagement. Because the question is not simply why did this happen. That question, I understood, would offer me nothing useful. The question is, what do I do now, and how do I do it correctly? Emotion is powerful, but strategy is stronger. Adrian had not simply had an affair. He had built a parallel life, a child, a household, a woman with his last name attached to her son's medical records. The resources required to maintain that over any significant period of time were considerable. And that meant there was a financial trail. which meant that the truth I had stumbled upon in a rain-gray Saturday afternoon was only the surface layer of a much deeper structure. I intended to map every inch of it. Quietly. Methodically. Without giving him any reason to believe I had begun. I began with what I already had access to. Our shared financial accounts. Investment portfolios that bore both our names. Business records I had helped organize in the early years of Adrian's firm, back when he relied on my organizational instincts to keep his paperwork from swallowing him whole. He had long since transferred that management to his firm's accounting department, but the passwords he had set in those early years, the ones I had helped him choose because he had never been good at creating memorable credentials, many of them had never been changed. The first evening I spent alone at my desk, the house quiet around me and Adrian at a dinner meeting downtown, I pulled the first 12 months of shared account statements and began reading them the way a forensic accountant reads a document, line by line, flagging anomalies, building a comparison against previous periods. The patterns appeared almost immediately. Regular transfers, consistent in size, routed to an account registered under a name I didn't recognize at first glance. When I cross-referenced the account number with the name listed on a forwarded insurance policy I found in his email, one he had left himself logged into on the household desktop, the name resolved into something recognizable. Natalie Brooks. The transfers had been occurring for at least 3 years within what I could access directly. School tuition payments to a private elementary institution on the north side of the city appeared under a business expense category with a description that, to a casual reader, would suggest professional development services. Medical insurance coverage extended under a family supplement rider that I had never been informed of. My own name was absent from that rider. Every document I found told a story. Adrian had never bothered to hide it from someone who wasn't looking. That had been his only strategy. And it had worked, until now. It was the timeline that undid me most completely, not in an emotional sense, but in the way that scale redefines the nature of a thing. The tuition records I found were for a child currently enrolled in first grade, which meant Ethan Hale was 6, perhaps 7 years old. His birth took place during a year I remembered with unexpected specificity. The year Adrian and I had renovated the kitchen, the year we had taken a 2-week trip through Portugal for our anniversary, the year I had briefly discussed with my doctor whether we should begin fertility consultations. Adrian had held my hand during that conversation. He had said that whatever we decided, he wanted us to face it together. Ethan would have been an infant at that point. I sat alone in the study for a long time after that calculation, the financial records spread across my desk in neat, ordered rows, and I let the arithmetic of it settle fully into my understanding. 6 years. Not an impulsive mistake. Not a brief collapse of judgment followed by remorse. 6 years of birthdays celebrated without me. 6 years of school mornings, pediatric checkups, Christmas mornings in another house. 6 years of calculated financial diversion from our shared accounts, money I had helped earn, that I had helped manage, funneled into a household built on my ignorance. The betrayal was not chaotic. It was disciplined, sustained, maintained with the same careful attention to detail that Adrian brought to his consulting work. And strangely, in a way I had not anticipated, that realization made me calmer than anything else I had discovered. Because it confirmed something important. I was not dealing with a man who had made a terrible mistake. I was dealing with a man who had made a deliberate choice, repeatedly, for 6 years. Which meant I could make deliberate choices too. I called Margaret Lawson on a Wednesday morning, 3 weeks after the Saturday of the rain. Her name had come to me through a colleague's passing mention at a fundraiser the previous spring. A family law attorney with a reputation for representing high-net-worth women in complex marital disputes. At the time I had filed the information away without understanding why. Perhaps some part of me had already sensed that I might need it someday. I told her office only that I was seeking a private consultation on a family matter of some urgency. Her assistant offered me an appointment the following afternoon. Her office occupied the upper floor of a building that overlooked the river downtown. Tall glass windows framed the afternoon in silver blue light, and the room was deliberately understated. No diplomas displayed, no aggressive evidence of credential. Just clean lines and a quality of attention that made itself felt immediately. I had prepared a summary document. 12 pages. Organized chronologically, with account numbers, transfer amounts, insurance policy details, and copies of the records I had accessed. I placed it on her desk and let her read. She read without interruption, making no sound, her expression maintaining the studied neutrality of someone who has heard many difficult things and has long since learned that visible reaction serves no one. When she finished, she folded her hands. She studied me for a moment. And then she asked a single question, in the measured tone of someone who already understood that the answer would determine everything about how we proceeded. "Do you want the truth," she said, "or do you want leverage?" I met her eyes without hesitation. "Both." A very small smile appeared at the corner of her mouth. "Then we have a great deal of work to do," she said. "And the good news is that you've already done most of it." The scope of the legal implications took an hour to walk through, and by the time Margaret finished, the afternoon light through her windows had gone from silver to deep amber. Adrian had used marital assets, funds generated from joint accounts during the course of our marriage, to finance a parallel domestic arrangement for a period of at least 6 years. The amounts, when totaled, were substantial. Not ruinous in isolation, but substantial enough, and the method of concealment had been sufficiently deliberate to suggest intent rather than carelessness. He had also, according to the insurance documentation I had found, listed Ethan Hale as a dependent on a supplemental policy in a manner that misrepresented the nature of the dependent relationship to the insurer. That was a separate issue, one with its own implications. The tax filings were what Margaret flagged most carefully. Certain dependent-related deductions had been claimed over multiple years in ways that, on examination, were difficult to reconcile with the financial declarations submitted jointly under both our names. She closed the folder when she had finished her review. "You have considerably more power in this situation than he realizes," she said simply. "The question now is how you choose to apply it, and in what sequence." I asked her to be specific. She was. We spent the next 40 minutes outlining a sequence of protective steps: financial reorganization, legal documentation, the careful preservation of every record I had gathered in a secure location outside our shared household. Nothing aggressive. Nothing that would signal movement prematurely. Just preparation. The architecture of an exit built so quietly that no alarm would sound until I was ready for it to. In the weeks that followed my meeting with Margaret, memory began doing something unexpected. It began reorganizing itself. Events I had catalogued without scrutiny, filed away in the ordinary archive of a shared life, surfaced now in a different light, rearranged by the new framework I was carrying. The mind, once given the correct key, insists on using it. The business trips that had lasted slightly longer than their stated purposes. I had never questioned them, had understood them as the natural overhead of a consulting practice that required face time with clients in other cities. But now I thought of specific instances: the conference in Atlanta that stretched from 3 days to 5, the Chicago engagement that had produced an apologetic phone call asking me to reschedule a dinner reservation we had been looking forward to, the weekends where unexpected meetings had materialized with the apologetic inconvenience of someone whose schedule was simply too demanding. The distracted quality of his attention at certain moments, which I had attributed to the pressures of a busy professional life. Moments where I had reached for him and found something slightly out of focus. What once felt like a loose collection of minor inconsistencies now arranged itself into a legible pattern. Not an accident. Not professional pressure. Architecture. He hadn't simply lied in the ordinary way of someone avoiding a difficult conversation. He had constructed a second life with the same methodical precision he applied to client deliverables. And I had lived adjacent to that construction for 6 years without seeing it, because I had trusted him, and trust, I was beginning to understand, is both the greatest gift we can offer another person and the most complete vulnerability we can ever assume. People assume that discovering a betrayal of this magnitude produces a particular emotional experience, a specific sequence of grief, rage, disorientation, collapse. Perhaps it does, for some. For me, the process was different. The pain was real and present, but it did not announce itself with the drama I might have expected. It arrived quietly, the way winter arrives, not in a single storm but in a gradual withdrawal of warmth, until one morning you simply notice that the light is thinner and the air has changed. I grieved privately, in small, contained increments. I grieved in the shower on a Tuesday morning when a particular memory of our wedding day surfaced without warning. Not the ceremony itself, but a moment afterward, the two of us alone in a corridor, Adrian laughing at something I had said, his hand warm against my face. I grieved in the car on the way to the grocery store, stopped at a light, for approximately 90 seconds. And then I drove on. Because what I was learning, through the discipline of those weeks, was that pain and purpose are not mutually exclusive. The grief was real. The strategy was also real. They occupied different chambers of the same self, and I learned to move between them with increasing fluency. Once you see a person clearly, not the version they have performed for you, but the actual architecture of who they are and what they have chosen, you stop asking why they hurt you. That question belongs to the version of yourself who still believed in the performance. The next version asks different questions. Cleaner ones. How do I move forward? What do I need to protect? What am I building? And what does it require of me now? Those questions gave me purpose. And purpose is a far more reliable companion than grief. The exit plan developed slowly, by design. Margaret had advised against urgency. Urgency, she explained, produces errors. It signals distress, and distress signals can be read by careful observers. Adrian was a careful observer, not of me, specifically, because he had long since stopped believing I warranted careful observation. But in situations that affected his interests, he was acutely attentive. I could not afford to become a situation that affected his interests until I was fully prepared. So I moved deliberately. One small action at a time, each one defensible in isolation, none of them alarming in the context of normal household administration. I opened a personal account at a financial institution we had never used together, citing a recommendation from a colleague for their investment products. Nothing unusual about that. People diversified their banking relationships regularly. I began incrementally rerouting portions of my own income, the consulting fees I had continued to earn independently through a small business advisory practice I maintained, into that account rather than our joint holdings. My income. My prerogative. Entirely legitimate. I reviewed and updated my personal estate documentation. Named a new primary beneficiary on accounts where I held sole ownership. A routine legal hygiene step, entirely unremarkable. I arranged a private storage facility for copies of every document I had gathered, not just digital backups, but physical copies in a fireproof lockbox that existed nowhere near our house. Each action was small, administrative, precise, but assembled together across those careful weeks, they formed something that had no small name. Freedom. Not freedom from grief. Not freedom from the complexity of what was coming. Freedom from vulnerability. From the condition of being the person in a room who knows least about what is actually happening. I would never occupy that position again. Independence, I was discovering, does not arrive as a feeling. It arrives as a decision, repeated until it becomes structural. I secured my finances with the patience of someone who understands that each individual step matters less than the cumulative architecture they create. I reorganized my investment allocations with advice from a financial advisor Margaret had recommended, a woman with a practical, understated manner who asked the right questions and drew no unnecessary conclusions aloud. I identified housing options. Not desperately, not urgently, but with the quiet thoroughness of someone who is conducting a market assessment rather than fleeing. I toured 2 properties on the pretext of evaluating rental investments, made reasonable inquiries, and noted what was available in neighborhoods that suited my needs. I made no commitments. I simply wanted to know what was possible. I ensured that every legal detail Margaret had identified as requiring attention was attended to in proper sequence. Powers of attorney. Updated beneficiary designations. Personal property documentation. The paper infrastructure of a life that could stand independently on its own foundations. I was not in a hurry. That was, perhaps, the most important discipline of all. Women in crisis tend to move too quickly. I had watched it happen to others, seen the costly mistakes that urgency produces. The premature confrontation that forfeits legal advantage. The emotional disclosure that alerts the adversary before the ground is stable. The impulsive action that can be characterized, in subsequent proceedings, as instability rather than justified response. I refused every impulse toward speed. By the time the preparation was complete, truly complete, not merely begun, I no longer felt afraid of what would come next. Because whatever happened, whatever Adrian decided to do or say or claim when the moment arrived, I would not be the person in the room without options. Meanwhile, Adrian became more relaxed. This, too, was something I observed with a quality of attention he never noticed. Deception maintained over a long period requires sustained effort. And sustained effort, when the deceiver believes the deception is succeeding, eventually produces a kind of ease, a loosening of the hypervigilance that characterized the early stages. Adrian had believed for years that I was simply not looking. Now, operating under the continued conviction that nothing had changed, he began to settle into a comfort that he had perhaps been holding just slightly at bay. He spoke more freely about the future. A vacation he wanted us to take in the spring, the south of France, a place we had discussed once years ago and never managed to arrange. He described it with the casual confidence of someone who assumes they will still have the same life in 6 months that they have today. New investment opportunities he was evaluating through the firm. Long-range financial planning. Discussions about renovating the guest rooms on the second floor, replacing the windows along the north side of the house. He sat across from me at dinner and described the life we would continue building together. I listened with the attentiveness I had always brought to our conversations. I asked thoughtful follow-up questions. I offered my genuine opinions where they were appropriate. And I watched him talk about our future with the serene composure of a woman who already knew that the future he was describing no longer existed, and who had already begun building a different one without him. It was an extraordinary thing to witness, in its way. The confidence of a man who believes himself safe. I let him believe everything was normal. This required a particular kind of performance, not dishonesty, exactly, but a form of restraint so disciplined it had its own internal aesthetic. Every dinner conversation continued at its accustomed pace. The weekends maintained their familiar shape. We attended a colleague's birthday celebration, a charity gala that Adrian's firm sponsored each November, a dinner with friends we had known for years. From the outside, our life hadn't changed. I was civil. I was present. I was warm in the ways that our marriage had always defined warmth, the small gestures of daily life that, assembled together, formed the impression of intimacy. I made coffee the way he liked it. I remembered details from his work conversations and asked appropriate follow-up questions. I laughed at the right moments. I did not perform unhappiness. Because unhappiness, prematurely displayed, is a signal. And I was done giving signals I had not chosen to send. What I was doing instead was something else. I was internalizing the full clarity of what I knew, holding it steady and still inside me like a flame inside a closed lantern. Contained. Controlled. Present. The balance of power in our marriage had shifted completely in those November weeks. A massive, tectonic shift, the kind that, in other circumstances, announces itself with noise and visible destruction. This one was silent. I held the new weight of it with a composure that surprised even me. Adrian sat across the dinner table, speaking about venture capital and spring travel itineraries. And he had no idea. Not the first suspicion. Not a single flicker of recognition. He simply didn't know. The first consequence arrived quietly, as I had intended. Certain financial authorizations that Adrian had previously relied upon without deliberate attention began to require additional processing time. Not dramatically, just enough to produce a minor friction, the kind that can be attributed, without suspicion, to routine administrative adjustment. A joint authorization on a particular investment account had been restructured, following advice from my financial advisor, in a way that required dual verification for large sum movements. Standard protective practice. The kind of thing that financial institutions recommend and implement regularly for accounts of a certain value. Adrian noticed a delay in one transaction toward the end of November. He mentioned it at breakfast, with the mild impatience of someone who is accustomed to his administrative life running without friction. I explained, calmly and specifically, that the account verification process had been updated following a routine security review. I cited the financial institution's name. I described the process accurately. I offered to provide the verification documentation if he needed it for his records. He accepted the explanation without question. which told me something important about the nature of his attention to our financial life. He had, in the years of our marriage, delegated the management of shared financial details to me, not because he was careless, but because I had always handled it competently, and he had found better uses for his own attention. He trusted the infrastructure I maintained the way a person trusts the plumbing in a well-built house, confidently, without monitoring it. He still trusted me. That trust was the final, small irony of our marriage. I noted it without sentiment. And continued. By early December, pressure had begun appearing in Adrian's professional world. Financial reviews initiated by regulatory bodies whose attention had been directed, through entirely proper and legal channels, towards certain account transactions that appeared, on examination, to require clarification. The accounts in question were business accounts that Adrian had used, in documented instances, to route payments that did not correspond to legitimate business expenses. Unexpected audits materialized in connection with the tax filings that Margaret had flagged, specifically, the dependent deductions that, when examined alongside the insurance documentation I had preserved, raised questions that the filings could not cleanly answer. Each of these developments traced back, in careful and documented sequence, to information I had preserved and properly disclosed. I had not manufactured any of it. I had not embellished or exaggerated. I had simply ensured that the documentation reached the people whose institutional responsibilities required them to examine it. Truth, properly organized and correctly directed, does its own work. The first indication I had that the pressure was registering came in the form of a change in Adrian's manner. Subtle. He was too practiced a professional to display open distress, but I knew the vocabulary of his moods with the fluency of 11 years. And what I began to see at the edges of his composure was a quality I recognized. Alertness. The particular vigilance of someone who has perceived that the environment around them has changed. He looked up from his phone at dinner one evening and studied me for a moment with an expression I couldn't fully read. I smiled at him. He smiled back. And I watched the alertness recede behind the reassurance of my composure. The confrontation happened in the kitchen. The same room where his phone had first illuminated beside me on a Thursday evening in October, with 5 words that had set everything that followed into motion. There was a symmetry in that which I had not planned but appreciated. It was a Sunday afternoon. Pale winter light came through the garden windows, flat and clear. I made tea. I placed 2 cups on the table, and then I placed the folder. Inside were copies of the documents I had gathered over the preceding weeks. Bank transfer records, organized chronologically, with the receiving account highlighted. Insurance policy documentation showing the dependent rider and the names it covered. The pediatric appointment confirmation. Tax filing comparisons across 3 years, with the relevant deduction lines annotated. A complete, organized record. Adrian stood on the other side of the kitchen island and looked at the folder without moving to open it. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he opened it. He turned each page with the careful deliberateness of someone buying time, though there was no time left to buy. His complexion changed. Not dramatically, just a slight withdrawal of color that I would not have noticed if I hadn't been watching for exactly that. He closed the folder. He stared at the table. "I can explain," he finally said. The oldest 4 words in the language. I looked at him with the calm that 11 weeks of deliberate preparation had given me. The calm of a woman who had already made every decision that mattered. "I'm sure you can," I said simply. And I picked up my tea. The legal proceedings unfolded over the months that followed with the unhurried gravity of institutional process. Formal filings initiated. Financial disclosures required, reviewed, compared against the documentation I had already assembled and preserved. Affidavits prepared and submitted. Discovery requests issued and answered, often incompletely, which produced their own subsequent complications for Adrian. Margaret moved through each phase with the efficient composure of someone who had mapped the terrain before setting out. She had seen versions of this before, she told me once, in the measured way she shared observations. Women who arrived in her office having done the hard internal work before asking for legal help. They were, she said, the clients whose outcomes were best. Adrian retained his own attorney, a former colleague who specialized in high-asset divorce litigation. There were preliminary meetings, exchanges of correspondence, periods of quiet that preceded bursts of activity. The process was neither fast nor emotionally uncomplicated. But it was, at every stage, manageable. Because I had prepared for it. The professional world, meanwhile, had begun to register the regulatory inquiries surrounding Adrian's firm. These things move slowly and then, suddenly, faster. A partner at his firm made a quiet inquiry to a mutual acquaintance that found its way back to me through an unexpected intermediary. People were beginning to ask questions. Adrian's name appeared in connection with the financial review in a way that was not yet public but was circulating in the specific, enclosed ecosystem of professional reputation, the world of client relationships and industry contacts where trust, once questioned, spreads its uncertainty with remarkable efficiency. Reputation, I had always known, is less a possession than an arrangement of trust held by others on your behalf. And trust, once examined, is very difficult to restore without accounting. I watched his confidence fade across those months with a detachment that I had worked to cultivate carefully. I did not want to take pleasure in it. That was important to me, internally, not because I owed him protection from consequences, but because I understood that a woman who takes pleasure in another person's unraveling is a woman who remains attached to the narrative of that unraveling. And I no longer wanted to be attached. What I watched instead was simply the exposure of what had always been there. The man who had once commanded every room he entered, who had carried himself with the assured, slightly lazy confidence of someone who has never been seriously questioned, began to fold inward. I observed it at the one professional event we both attended before the proceedings became widely known. He stood at the edge of conversations rather than at their center. His answers to straightforward questions were slightly slower than they used to be. He was recalibrating, reassessing what he could still count on. The answer, it was becoming clear to people who knew him professionally, was less than he had believed. The mask, in the language of the internal narrative I had been writing across those months, had fallen. And what lay beneath it was not the competence and authority it had always advertised. What lay beneath it was a simpler thing. A man who had divided his life into compartments because he believed none of them would ever be required to speak to each other, and who was now discovering, in real time, that compartmentalization is a strategy, not a permanent condition. It fails. Eventually, all compartments open. The consequences arrive not dramatically, but as consequences tend to arrive when they are the product of documentation rather than emotion, methodically, in sequence, with a momentum that builds upon itself. Business partnerships that had been in place for years underwent what Adrian's attorney characterized, in one filing, as reassessment in light of evolving circumstances. 2 of the firm's major client relationships were suspended pending the outcome of the regulatory review. A third client declined to renew a contract that had, until the preceding year, been considered one of the firm's most stable revenue sources. Social relationships followed their own quiet logic. Invitations to the industry events and dinner gatherings that had formed the social infrastructure of Adrian's professional identity began to decline. Not with an explicit statement, no one said anything as direct as that. But calendars quietly reorganized themselves, and the network of casual social commerce that sustains professional reputation operated as it always does, by rooting around friction. Truth, once in motion, does not require management. It simply moves. And Adrian's carefully maintained double life, the version of himself he had presented to clients, to colleagues, to friends who had known us as a couple for a decade, could not survive contact with the fuller truth that was now, piece by piece, becoming part of the record. I watched from a careful distance. I had not orchestrated a campaign. I had simply refused to continue being the infrastructure that held the false version of his life upright. When a load-bearing wall is removed, the structure settles according to its own mathematics. I had simply stepped out of the way. He asked to meet in February. A text message to my phone, the first direct personal communication since the kitchen confrontation, since the attorneys had established the protocols of mediated exchange. He named a cafe near the river, one we had gone to occasionally on weekend mornings before the city began to feel busy. A neutral location, he might have thought. Or perhaps just familiar. I agreed. Margaret saw no reason not to. And there was something I wanted from the meeting that had nothing to do with legal proceedings. Closure, perhaps. Or completion. The particular ending that can only be achieved by two people occupying the same room after everything has been said. He was already seated when I arrived. He looked older than he had in the autumn. Not physically deteriorated, but diminished in some quality that had always been present in him. The ambient confidence that had once preceded him into every room he entered. That quality had withdrawn. He held his coffee cup with both hands and looked at me with an expression I recognized as genuine, which surprised me slightly. It was grief. Not performed for my sympathy. Just actual, unguarded grief. "I never thought you would do this," he said. His voice was quiet. Controlled but effortful. I studied him for a moment before answering. "You never thought I would find out," I said. There was a distinction in that, and I believed he understood it. The thing he had not anticipated was not my response. It was my knowledge. He had built the entire architecture of deception on the foundation of my not knowing, and the moment that foundation shifted, everything above it had eventually followed. We sat across from each other in the cafe for another hour. There was nothing left to negotiate. But we sat anyway. The day I left the house fell on a Thursday in late March, when the maple trees along our street had just begun the business of putting out their first small leaves, pale green and tentative, the way beginnings always are. I had arranged the movers for the early afternoon. There was less to move than I had expected. I had been deliberate about what I wanted to carry forward, and deliberate about what I was content to leave behind. The physical objects of 11 years of shared living were, in the end, just objects. I had chosen the ones that were genuinely mine and let the rest remain. The last box went into the truck at 3:17 in the afternoon, according to the clock on my phone. I stood on the front walk and looked at the house for a moment, at the door we had replaced in our second year there, at the windows Adrian had wanted double-paned and I had agreed were worth the cost, at the garden that had been my project from the beginning and would, I knew, decline without consistent attention. I noticed all of it. I did not feel the things I had expected to feel. What I felt was simpler than anything I could have predicted during those early November days when the weight of what I had discovered had first settled fully onto my shoulders. I felt quiet. The particular quality of quiet that belongs to honest silence, not the silence of suppressed knowledge or managed performance, not the silence of a woman keeping her composure by force. Just quiet. The ordinary, spacious, entirely genuine quiet of a person who is exactly where they have chosen to be, carrying exactly what they have chosen to carry. I got in my car. I drove away from the house where I had lived for 11 years. The afternoon light was good. People imagine revenge as a loud thing. An explosion. A confrontation that brings the walls down in a dramatic cascade of recrimination and exposure. The theatrical unmasking. The moment where the wronged party delivers the perfectly constructed speech and watches the person who hurt them comprehend, finally, the full weight of what they have done. That is one story. But there is a quieter version, and it is, I have come to believe, considerably more powerful. It is the version where a woman discovers that the life she believed in was constructed on a foundation of sustained dishonesty, and instead of collapsing into the grief of that discovery, she becomes very still. She thinks. She plans. She gathers what she needs. She protects herself with the precision and patience of someone who understands that the integrity of her future matters more than the satisfaction of an immediate response. And then she moves. Not in rage. Not in performance. But with the specific, unhurried purpose of a person who has decided, once and finally, that she will not continue to be the unknowing support structure for someone else's deception. Adrian had believed he could maintain two complete lives in the same world, indefinitely, without consequence. He had believed I was not looking. He had believed that the trust one extended to him was identical to blindness. He was wrong on each count. The truth surfaced, as truth, in my experience, reliably does, not because I forced it into the open dramatically, but because I stopped preventing it from being seen. I had been, without knowing it, the primary mechanism by which his double life was sustained. My competence, my management of our shared financial and administrative world, my fundamental assumption of his honesty, all of it had been the scaffolding around his deception. When I removed that scaffolding, there was nothing left to hold the structure up. I did not destroy his life. I simply stopped protecting it. And in doing so, I built the beginning of my own. Quietly. Precisely. entirely on my own terms. That, I have decided, is the only form of resolution that leaves a person whole. Not the explosion. Not the performance. Just the patient, deliberate work of becoming, again, entirely yourself.